Hello. Today we're going to be talking about how the brain is protected. So, nervous tissue is really soft and delicate. Your brain has a consistency similar to that of like cold oatmeal. So, imagine like sticking your finger in cold oatmeal and it like squishes. So, it's important that we have lots of stuff to be able to protect the squishiness of our oatmeal. And we've already talked about them. So, take a minute and try to come up with them. Hopefully, you thought of the skull. Of course, we have bone that protects our brain. And we've also mentioned the cerebrospinal fluid, like the brain is floating in a watery cushion, a liquid. And then I think that some of you might already be familiar with the blood-brain barrier from when we talked about the astrocytes. That's another one. And then the fourth one is the meninges, or different membranes that are able to protect the brain. So now I'm going to talk about those four in more detail. Starting off with the skull, think about how thin the skull is. Good analogy is to think about the thickness of an eggshell, and the actual human skull is not much thicker than that. It's kind of crazy that something so thin is able to be strong. The skull can't protect us from everything, though. I want to mention concussions because I know that a lot of you guys are athletes. So when we get a concussion can be caused by like a blow to the head, like it could be caused from a ball hitting your head, or you could literally just fall and hit your head. But basically what happens is when you hit your head, your brain, because it's sitting in that fluid, will hit like one side of the skull and then it will bounce off the other side, then it will bounce off the other side. So the brain kind of like bounces back and forth, which damages our neurons. It can cause them to stretch and it can cause them to tear. And also, multiple hits to the head cause cumulative damage. So if you've already got hit in the head and then you get hit in the head again, it's even worse. So it's something to take seriously and to not play if you think you're in danger of. Here's a video if you're interested in learning more about concussions. Next, I'm going to talk about the meninges, or the three membranes that cover the brain. Like all membranes, these are all made out of connective tissue, so a function of binding and holding things together. This is the black line is my drawing of the brain and the little gyri, the ridges right there. And then the orange membrane that's like immediately touching the brain is called the pia mater. It's very thin, and you can imagine it almost like cling film. Like it tightly hugs the brain and it even goes in all the curves. So this one is literally like holding the brain tissue together. And then there's some space. This space is where we would find the cerebral spinal fluid. And this green membrane is the arachnoid layer, and it has small threads of connective tissue hanging off of it. The threads are supposed to resemble cobwebs, which is why we call it the arachnoid layer. And then this space in here is where the cerebral spinal fluid will circulate between the pia and the arachnoid mater. And then superficial to the arachnoid, we have the dura mater. It's a tough, kind of leathery layer, and that's the layer that's in between basically the brain and the bone. It also consists of two layers, even though I only drew it of one. The bottom layer is called the meningeal layer, and the top layer is called the periosteal layer. If you remember, the periosteum is what we call the membrane around the bone. So the periosteum is actually continuous with the dura mater. Like the periosteal layer of the dura mater just turns into the periosteum of the skull. I'll show you a picture of that if that is confusing now. So here's our same one with the pia, the arachnoid, and the dura, and then I have added in the skull. Remember the compact bone with the spongy bone in the middle, and that kind of dark line right there that's touching the dura mater, that could be the periosteum, and then the surrounded by some red skin there, and then also hair, but I didn't draw that. Here's a model of it that we made in class. In real life, the pia mater is going to be clinging to the brain, like there's not any space between the nervous tissue and the pia. And then the arachnoid is this like wax paper, and they picked this because like the little crinkles in it remind them of cobwebs, and there's also space, and the space is where the cerebral spinal fluid goes. And then finally, on top of our arachnoid mater, we have the dura mater. This blue foam is the meningeal layer of the dura, and the yellow foam is the periosteal layer of the dura. And then right on top of this would be the skull. And here's our professional diagram. So hopefully you can orient yourself to it now. Let's start down here. I really only drew like one little layer of the brain, but this is the white matter and the gray matter of the brain. So all of this stuff is brain tissue. And then this little teeny layer right there, that is the pia mater. Like it literally just looks like a little line. And then out here, this kind of like slightly thicker white layer, that is the arachnoid mater. And then these little strings hanging off of it, that is like why it looks like a cobweb. And then this space in here, that would be where the cerebral spinal fluid is. And then on top of the arachnoid mater, we have the dura mater. So it's these two layers right here. And if we switch over here so you can actually see the words, the dura mater. So the bottom layer right here that touches the meninges is the meningeal layer, and then the top layer that's continuous with the bone is the periosteal layer. And then this is the skull, this is the top periosteum, and then that would be the skin. So from the bottom to the top, right here is brain. There's our little pia mater. There's the arachnoid mater. These two layers are the dura mater, the meningeal layer, the periosteal layer. Then we have the bone, we have the periosteum, the membrane around the bone, and finally skin. So a lot of membranes in there holding stuff together, giving a place for things to be able to attach to, and also holding arteries, veins, stuff like that in place. Next, we're going to talk about cerebral spinal fluid. The cerebral spinal fluid forms a watery cushion that protects the brain against blows to the head. So when we get a concussion, it failed, but a lot of times it does its job pretty well. The cerebral spinal fluid goes through the entire central nervous system, so that includes the whole brain and the spinal cord down here. So everything blue is the cerebral spinal fluid, and those arrows are showing how it circulates. So it goes all the way around the brain, it goes through our brainstem right here, and then it's going to go all the way around the spinal cord. And notice there's a little canal in the middle of the spinal cord that's also filled with this cerebral spinal fluid. Sometimes you can get like a blockage right here. And what would happen if we had a blockage right in here? Then the cerebrospinal fluid would not be able to flow anymore. That would be bad. In a baby, this is called, well, in a baby or an adult, this causes a condition called hydrocephalus. But in a baby, it's really noticeable because like if it's blocked right here, then all of the fluid will start to gather and it actually like expands their skull since their skull bones aren't fused together. In an adult, it's even worse because the skull is fused together. The only way for the water to go is in, so it presses against the brain tissue. The ideal treatment for this would be to insert like a shunt, a little tube, to be able to drain the fluid. You can do a little experiment. So in this example, the egg represents the brain, the plastic container represents the skull, and if you can tell, there's water in this container that's supposed to represent the cerebral spinal fluid. This one has the egg brain, it has the plastic container skull, but it does not have any cerebral spinal fluid. And then you can shake both of these, and what happens? The container with the cerebral spinal fluid keeps the brain intact. Yay. And then without the cerebral spinal fluid, we see how it breaks. And finally today, we are going to talk about the blood-brain barrier. So this is located in the capillaries that are surrounding the brain. So here's a capillary, a blood vessel, and why does this matter? The oxygen and the nutrients that come from your heart and your stomach get carried to the brain in a blood vessel. So that oxygen needs to be able to diffuse out of the blood vessel and actually get to the brain tissue. However, the brain is super sensitive. If it has like the wrong concentration, like too many sodium ions or too many potassium ions, it could cause it to misfire and send signals when we don't want it to send signals, and that can cause seizures. That is why we have these astrocytes that create the blood-brain barrier. So basically means the brain is extra protected so that we can maintain its stable environment. The blood-brain barrier is made of three different layers. The endothelium of the capillary. Endothelium means epithelial tissue. So like these cells right here, they're little squamous epithelial cells. We call them endothelium, basically anytime they line the inner cavity. And then this isn't shown on my diagram, but you know that all epithelial tissue has a basement membrane of connective tissue called the basal lamina. So like directly surrounding the capillary would be that connective tissue layer, the basal lamina. And then finally, the astrocytes have these like super bulbous feet, but they will cling to the capillary. And then anything, like if something's trying to escape, it can't get out right there because that foot is in the way. So it has to get out in the gaps in between them. Let's zoom in down here. Oh yeah, and this is another thing that I forgot to say. So right here, this red thing, that's our epithelial tissue that forms our endothelium. And these tissues are held very tightly together and they form what's called like tight junctions. So normally epithelial cells, they kind of just like layer on top of each other, but there's space, like substances would be able to squeeze out in between them normally, like in your lungs or in your feet. However, in the brain, the capillary cells are held together by tight junctions, so things cannot just slip out through them. Instead, they're forced to leave only through these transport proteins. So the capillary forms part of that. Right here, we're seeing the basal lamina that would also have to go through. And then after something gets out through a protein, it's still going to be regulated by the astrocyte. The astrocyte will actually take it up and then deliver it to the neuron in the brain that needs it. The blood-brain barrier is highly selective, but it's not perfect. So nutrients like glucose and amino acids can pass through, but it's able to keep out like waste products, toxins, and a lot of drugs. Anything that is fat soluble is able to get through. So fats and fatty acids. Unfortunately, fat soluble molecules like alcohol and nicotine are able to get through, and also tiny molecules like oxygen and carbon dioxide are able to get through. So it's not keeping everything out, it's just letting only a few select things through so that it doesn't cause accidental brain activity. There's a few parts of the brain that don't have the blood-brain barrier because they need to have unfiltered access to what the blood is like. This is the hypothalamus, and particularly the pituitary gland right there. That does not have a blood-brain barrier because it has to know what's going on in the blood to be able to respond. It needs to be able to test out, it needs to be able to feel like what's the concentration, what hormones are present, what's the temperature, so that it can respond appropriately. And then this green part right here, the brainstem, down here is the medulla oblongata. It has all the centers like the respiratory center, the cardiovascular center. It also has a vomiting center. So there is no blood-brain barrier around this vomiting center for the same reason as the pituitary gland. It needs to be able to sense the blood and trigger vomiting like as a protective mechanism. For example, if you drink an excessive amount of alcohol, this medulla oblongata is going to be able to sense the alcohol in your blood and tell you to throw up instead of dying. So it's a good thing. And that's a wrap on the brain. Please send me all your questions. Oops.